It's 6:33, and we like to start here on time at Books, Booze, and Brains. So happy to have you all here tonight. I know many of you. I'm Krista Hoffman-Longton. I'm an assistant dean at the IU Medical School and an assistant professor in the communication department at IUPUI, and I am so honored to be the moderator for Books, Booze, and Brains. This is such a great community, and we're so happy to see all of your faces and continue to see you while we are here at home and safe. So happy Thanksgiving, everybody, as we head into this week. I'm very thankful to have all of you and to have this science communication community. It's a great place to connect with all of you, and it's one of the things I look forward to every month. So Leah from Indiana Humanities is going to give a quick preview of what to expect for the spring season of Books, Booze, and Brains. I'll let her do that before we head over into ground rules. So Leah, I'll turn the mic over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Krista. So normally when we meet in person, we hand out the schedule for the next season. So all of this will come to you digitally following probably in about 2 weeks. We're just finalizing the date on which books will get read. But I thought it'd be fun to share what books we're planning to read for next semester. So in no particular order, we're going to read Ready Player 2. And so if you were around when we did Ready Player 1, Matt and George, which were two of the kind of game theory, game designer guys that joined us, are going to come back. So we're really excited about that. We are going to read The Rise and Fall of Dinosaurs, A New History of a Lost World. So I think that will be really fun. We're going to try to time that to the arrival of Sue the T-Rex, who is coming to Indianapolis. So that should be fun. We're reading Rocket Boys, which will be fun. And we have an engineer who's been involved with, who's kind of splits his time. He works at Cummins, and he's always also involved in Guatemala's space program. So I think that will be a really fun discussion. We are, and this is a shout out to Rufus, we are finally reading a book about like astrophysics. So we're going to read Astrophysics for People in a Hurry by Neil deGrasse Tyson. I know that's been a request. Some version of that has been a request for a long time. So we're going to finally do it. And then we're also going to read The Superior, The Return of Race Science, which was on a lot of 2019 best science books of the year. So I think that'll be a really good discussion. So that's all I wanted to say. I can put those in the chat. So if you want to start requesting books or getting them for Kindles, they can do that. Thanks, Krista.
Absolutely. And thanks to the planning team for choosing really exciting books for our spring season. We're so happy to, I think, put together a really interesting group of scientists and have a really diverse group of books. One of the things I love about this community is just the chance to read things from sort of multiple different perspectives, really fun opportunities. So as we get started here, just want to give a few ground rules to get us started. Let me begin by thanking our sponsors. So the Books, Booze, and Brains Book Club is sponsored by Indiana Humanities, Indiana Sciences, and March for Science. And that's the group that helps to handle our live stream. So welcome to all the folks that are joining us via Facebook and Twitter. And then Centrally in Indiana Science Outreach. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for supporting these great events that we have every month. It's really wonderful to have you as a part of this community. Leah's putting those books in the chat for the spring season. So as a reminder, as you're putting together your holiday list or as you're requesting books from the library, she'll have those ready to go for you. So here are some ground rules for Zoom. We've gotten pretty well used to this, but I want to make sure that we revisit those. So the first thing is, please try to make sure that you're muted while you're not talking. That helps us to handle ambient noise and just helps me to kind of help our guests stay focused, and we'll have plenty of time to connect with one another in our breakout rooms, as many of you know. Please be yourself in this space. If you can, turn your camera on. We'd love to see your smiling face, and be respectful of others, especially in the chat. Sometimes in that chat space, the things that come out of our fingers are not exactly what will come out of our mouths. You can use the reactions feature on the bottom toolbar to offer feedback non-verbally. So there's some clapping hands and some thumbs up there that you can use. If you'd like to ask a question while we're talking, you're welcome to use the chat box to do that. And I'll ask Leah and Jen and Rufus and Rachel to just help me keep track of the chat. You know, I get to talking and sometimes miss some of our great conversation that happens in the chat. The last thing is that when you turn on your mic to speak after our breakout sessions, you may experience a half-second delay. So take a breath before you start speaking, just so that we can hear everything that you're saying. As a reminder of how our session will go tonight, we'll have an opportunity to hear from Dr. Friesen, Amanda Friesen, our featured scientist for tonight. And then we'll send you into some breakout rooms where we'll give you a broad topic question to cover as a part of your breakout conversation, as if we were having a tabletop conversation in the bar. And then we'll come back and we'll hear a little bit about your ideas and perspectives from your small group. And we'll do that a few times before we have plenty of time to ask Dr. Friesen some questions. So with that, I think that we'll go ahead and get started. So a welcome, Dr. Amanda Friesen. We're so happy to have you tonight. I'm wondering if you can tell us, as we start, a little bit about yourself and how your work relates to this month's book. And I think that you have, as I recall, a pretty personal connection to this book, given that you're in the acknowledgements.
Thank you, Krista. First of all, I think it's awesome that this community exists, and I certainly am excited to be part of it. Krista and I are co-faculty members in the School of Liberal Arts, and oftentimes science isn't at the top of the kinds of things that we talk about, so it's really fun to connect to a group like this. And so, yeah, when she mentioned that you were all reading Predisposed, I thought that was really interesting, and wondered kind of how she chose that book and so on, because two of the authors were actually my PhD supervisors, and I was co-manager of their physiology lab when I was in graduate school at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So much of the theories, the studies, and the findings that they talk about in this book were either part of experiments and studies that either I actually helped carry out, or papers that I worked on, or at least theories and methods that I was taught and helped to form at that time. So what's really also interesting about it is John Alford. So Kevin Smith and John Hibbing were my supervisors, and John Alford is at Rice University, and his PhD student, Alex Shanskevich, and I connected through our advisors, and now we like to call ourselves Biopolitics 2.0. So we're like the second generation of folks who have taken up the mantle of studying things like how behavioral genetics and physiology and our sensory systems might connect to the way that we perceive the political world.
Thanks, Amanda. You gave a kind of a brief definition there, but I'm wondering, before we jump into our first turn and talk question, if you could go into a little bit more about the field of biopolitics and kind of how your work nowadays connects to that field.
Sure, and it's one of those things, I know biopolitics exists as a concept in some philosophy of science and some ethics and other kinds of conversations. When in political science we talk about biology and politics or biopolitics, most of the time we're talking about the application of life science methods to political questions, right? So this is life science or psychology, because you could think about cognition, neuroscience, et cetera, as being psychological approaches, but then also thinking about sensory systems, endocrinology, heart rate variability, electrodermal response. All these kinds of things are life science approaches. And what we're trying to do is to see if we can, or I guess one of the goals of this kind of approach is trying to understand, beyond just what people tell us in surveys, if we can uncover perhaps some implicit attitudes, or how deep-seated certain kinds of attitudes are, such that it's to the very ends of their biology, and it's expressed in the way that their parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems respond to various kinds of stimuli. Did that answer it?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I think, as we dig into this a little bit more deeply, one of the, and I think this is kind of true every month, we always have some folks who have a chance to read the whole book and some folks that don't. And I think that this gives a really good kind of foundation to be able to begin kind of talking about this idea that for some of us seems really foreign. As I was preparing for tonight, I listened to a lecture that John Hibbing gave, and one of the things that he talked about was that he always begins the political science 100 level course by asking his students where they think their political views come from. And I think that his answer is pretty surprising. So do you want to talk about that a little bit before we kind of jump into some of the details?
Yeah, I don't know that I've seen that talk of his, but I'm sure I've heard him say these kinds of
That's what
things.
I figured, yeah.
Yeah, another fun fact is when I was in graduate school, The Daily Show came and did interviews. Asif Manvi interviewed John Hibbing and Kevin Smith about this kind of work. So that was like one of the coolest moments, right, of graduate school. So I thought, is this academia? Is this how this works? But yeah, so I think that people like to think about politics as this rational enterprise, right? So they might argue, well, I learned from my parents, or I got it from my community, or my faith community, or my cohort, that kind of thing. And certainly in their environmental influences, they're really important, right? Because if you are a person who is born in rural France, you're not going to be an American Republican. Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? No. So of course you're going to be influenced by what's available to you in the menu of options within your culture and your political system. But to suggest that people at some point sit down and write out the pros and cons of belonging to this party and that party, and how do I feel about this public policy and this public policy, they don't do that, right? We know most people don't even really pay attention to politics or are interested on a day-to-day basis. And in fact, there is evidence that the most politically engaged actually engage in more motivated reasoning than the folks who don't really pay attention at all, right? And so I'm sure motivated reasoning is a term that many of you have heard, that has gotten into the popular consciousness of course, people understanding information sort of based upon their priors, right? They evaluate new information based upon the kinds of things that they already think. And it takes a lot more pieces of new information for them to change their mind on this sort of prior. And so, I always find it really amusing when people think that they're being really logical about politics, because we're very good at backwards rationalizing why we believe the things that we believe. But all you have to do is look at people's inconsistencies, right? So this has been a debate in political science for 60 years, right? So do people have a coherent ideology or do they not? So on one hand, you have Philip Converse, who's the famous person who's like, the average person does not have an ideology. They just have this sort of subset of issues that they believe this way and that way, and you can easily find inconsistencies, right? Whereas other people say, well, there are some maybe underlying beliefs that might form some of their policy attitudes, such that if they think that there should be reduced government spending on this kind of program, then they would think there should be reduced government spending on this other kind of program, right? And so I think that debate is continuing on, whether people really kind of have this. And the part of the problem is that as scholars, we think we know how we should define a coherent ideology, right? So we want to do this top down, well, if you're pro-life, you should be anti-death penalty. Well, that's not exactly how people think about these things, right? And so trying to uncover these non-conscious responses or these implicit attitudes that people form over time, that could be genetic, it could be part of their personality, or it could be a learned behavior that has just been instantiated, is really helpful in us understanding why we don't know how to explain human political behavior very well.
Thanks. I think that gives us a really good kind of basis to start from, right? Because part of what we're talking about here, at least for me anyway, as someone who doesn't study these fields, is sort of a new way of thinking about how we understand our engagement with politics, which I think that we do see as primarily sort of learned behavioral type approaches. And so that kind of leads me to our first question, which is really about how we define, in the United States anyway, how we sort of define our sense of self in this space. And so Hibbing begins the book by talking about the labels liberal and conservative. And, Hibbing and colleagues in this book sort of argue that these labels are inherently flawed, right? That they have a bunch of sort of connotations that have come over time that maybe aren't particularly helpful. But if you're going to write a book about this, you need a way to sort of talk about these two camps of people. So they opt to use the terms despite their flaws. So my first turn and talk question, and I'll open the breakout rooms here in just a minute. And when that opens, you'll get a notification on your screen. Just click and it'll take you right into the breakout room. And so my first turn and talk question is, are the labels liberal and conservative flawed, as Hibbing and colleagues argue? And what utility might they have beyond just this book? So again, that question is, are the labels liberal and conservative flawed, and what utility might they have beyond this book? So as a reminder, Amanda and I will stay in this main room. So Amanda, when you get a breakout notification, just don't leave. And we'll ask everyone else to head into your breakout rooms. You'll have about 10 minutes or so to have a conversation with your group members, get to know one another. This is a space where we really love that, have the opportunity to connect. And then we'll call you back in a few minutes to have a larger group conversation. So I'm gonna go ahead and open those breakout rooms now. And again, you should receive a notification on your screen to move into your breakout room. If you have trouble accessing the breakout room, go ahead and let us know in the chat, and we'll be happy to help you with that. Leah's got the Turn and Talk question here in the chat. If you want to copy and paste that, you can bring it with you into the chat. And give us just a minute, Amanda. I'm going to make sure that we've got everybody over into the breakout rooms before we get started. All right, it looks like the breakout rooms are up and going. Let's see here. We have some other folks that have joined. Give me just a second. I'm going to try to get those folks managed and get them into breakout. Natalie, Mary, we have a couple of folks on the phone. If you would like to join a breakout room, you can, you're welcome to. Or if you just want to hang out in this main room, that's fine as well. If you have any tech trouble, just let us know in the chat and we'll go ahead and get you into a breakout room if you'd like to engage with a smaller group. Happy to do that. All right, so Amanda, our first turn and talk question then is really kind of about semantics to some extent, but I think that it runs a little bit deeper than that. And that is sort of, can you talk a little bit about kind of what utility using terms like liberal and conservative have, particularly when we're talking about studying sort of the science of politics?
Yeah, it's interesting. So one of the first publications that that I was a part of that came out of the lab was published in the the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society B, right? So this science, one of the longest running science journals since Copernicus or something, right? Which is pretty cool. And the title is insane. It's "The Political Left Rolls with the Good, the Political Right avoids the bad," or whatever it is. And it's like, because we couldn't do liberals and conservatives because this is a UK journal, and we were hoping to get more international buy-in. And so one of the things that makes it difficult is that liberal and conservative, they work in the American context because people are kind of familiar with what they mean colloquially. But a lot of us doing this research, are suggesting that many of our findings, of course, extend beyond the American context. So trying to use these terms isn't very helpful. For example, if you're trying to describe politics in various other countries. So Last year, I was on sabbatical at the University of Amsterdam and working with several Dutch researchers there who do this kind of work with physiology, emotions, and politics. And of course, the Dutch political system is this multi-party system. People flip their vote around and around. Like there's parties come up, they go away. Like it's probably one of the most different democracies as compared to the United States. And so something like liberal and conservative can be a bit more difficult. I think the word conservative tends to be a bit more universal. Liberal, of course, one of the problems with that is that a liberal democracy is a particular form of, I don't know, modern government, a philosophy of ruling, et cetera. And so if you think about like in the UK, the Lib Dems, right? So the word liberal is in their title, but yet in some respect, the Labour Party would be further left on some issues, right? So this term liberal can be problematic. I have a colleague actually who published a few years ago, I think the title of the publication is The L Word. And he talks about how the word liberal has become this dirty word, right? So owning the libs, that thing that you hear again and again. So you'll notice that the left in the United States have started using what? Progressive, right? They use this term progressive, because the word liberal makes it sound that like just anything goes, you know, this and that, et cetera. So that's part of the problem. The other issue with it from a measurement perspective is that the majority of Americans like liberal policies. If you ask Americans, do you want government-sponsored healthcare? Majority say yes. Do you want a higher minimum wage? Yes. Do you want labor protections? Yes. Do you want more spending on education? Yes. Well, these are all liberal policies, right? So this makes most Americans operationally liberal. Like that's what they want from government. But if you ask them on a 7-point scale from extremely liberal to extremely conservative, where do you place yourself? More Americans place themselves centered to a little bit to the right. They're slightly conservative or conservative, which we call symbolically or symbolic ideology, right? And so you have this, and so when the easiest way to look at this is in states that have ballot initiatives or referendums, you could have Republicans win every office in the state, and yet every referendum that's a liberal policy also pass. Marijuana legalization, raising the minimum wage, right? And so you could say that somehow, you know, maybe people don't fully understand what they want, but there is something, and this is back to this sort of identity politics, right? So that people have this identity of, well, I'm a pretty conservative person, which means I'm measured, or at least I'm not like those crazy Hollywood types, or whatever it is that's associated with being liberal, and so on. And so from sort of an identity perspective, it can be kind of challenging. And from a measurement perspective, you're measuring something, but you're certainly not measuring people's actual preferences for how they want to be governed.
It's a really good point. I mean, I think about some of I am a more humanistic researcher, but some of the work that I did on my master's thesis looked at women who identified with most, sort of approaches to feminist ideology, but didn't necessarily want to define themselves as feminists. And I think the same thing holds true, right? That to some extent, there's been a connotation over time that has been developed. When I think that we can, probably have a robust conversation about where those connotations come from. About a particular label, and then when you come to a survey or when you engage in a conversation with others at family dinner or at a cocktail party or whatever, it's much harder for you to fully identify with a particular group. And in this case, because the fear, I think in part, and I'll ask you maybe what the fear is about. I think it's about being perceived as somehow deviant. And so it'd be interesting to hear kind of what do you think is why does it get sort of the L word treatment?
Well, and in some respects, some of these divisions are really describing white Americans, right? So, for example, African Americans, Latinx Americans, many Asian Americans would also consider themselves conservative in perhaps their cultural, societal, religious beliefs, but are going to support progressive policies and identify with the Democratic Party for a lot of reasons. And so, that is another kind of way of thinking about it, that we have a lot of people who would think about themselves as conservative because of these other beliefs that they have. And in the United States, I mean, we are center right. Our Democratic Party is center right or barely center left compared to most parties that are in advanced democracies with social welfare states, right? So our complete lack of social protections and the fact that that's a leftist policy is bizarre, because in most countries in Europe, they have at least, or many countries in Europe, Northern and Western Europe, they're going to have more protections than we have, and that's not thought of as left right. And so there is the other piece to this is what we tend to call a social and an economic dimension to ideology, right? So the classic what you hear is, well, I'm a fiscal conservative but a social liberal kind of stuff, right? So you hear that from time to time in the US. And what's bizarre about that is in most parts of other democracies, the kind of libertarian fiscal conservatism just isn't quite present there, because like government is there to facilitate all sorts of programs that are supposed to help the people. And so I guess that's not quite what you asked, but it's a piece of it.
No, but I think that helps to illustrate sort of where those ideas might come from in a way that we haven't considered. So let me bring everybody back from the breakout rooms. And when I do that, I'll ask you to, I'll sort of re-ask you the question, and I'll ask you to repeat some of the things that we said here in the main room. All right, we are welcoming everybody back here in just a few minutes. Amanda, one of the things that I always use as sort of a gauge of whether or not folks are having good conversations is how quickly folks come back to the breakout rooms. You might do that in your class, or come back from the breakout rooms. And so, it seems like all of our folks are getting kicked out of their breakout rooms, which is always a good sign. So kudos to you. All right, we'll get everybody back here in just a second or so. We've got about 20 seconds before they get kicked back. Welcome back, everyone. I know that we have a few folks that are still joining us back from their breakout rooms. So happy to have you back in the main room here. As a reminder, as we kind of dig deeply into this book, I know that this is just a wonderful and respectful community, but I'll remind everyone to do your best to be respectful of one another, and we'll make sure to have, I think, a really productive conversation. Hopefully you did that in your small groups. So while you were in your breakout rooms, I asked Dr. Friesen the same questions that I asked you all to answer, which are the labels that we use in the United States, liberal and conservative, to what extent are those flawed? And also kind of how are they useful, or what might we be able to use them for? And so Amanda, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of where some of the ideas around these terms being flawed comes from before we jump into asking our groups to sort of share their ideas?
Sure. From the perspective of the kind of work that I do as a political psychologist, liberal conservative isn't terribly useful because I have started working across cultures. And so we tend to say like left and right if we can, because that has a little bit better of approximation. And you can think about, so the word liberal, like liberal democracy, is a way of governing, it's a type of governance and so on. And so something like the Lib Dems in the UK would not be the kind of liberal that Americans would think about, right? And, conservative is kind of a standard, almost nearly every country has a conservative party of some kind that you can associate with. But you think about something like the Christian Democrats in Germany, for example, they're going to support social welfare protections that the conservative Republican Party in the US would not. And so these terms are kind of difficult. They're not very universal culturally. But the other issue is within the United States, you have a few things going on. So as political scientists, for the last probably 40 years, we have understood ideology to have at least two dimensions, so an economic and a social or a cultural dimension. And so because you only have two parties, people sort of sort into those, but they're not always a perfect match. So you might be someone who is culturally conservative or religiously conservative, but you support liberal progressive policies. And so you are in the Democratic Party, and maybe that's not like a good fit for you, but it's the best fit from that perspective. or the opposite direction. Like you might, be like a libertarian, for example, who would, not really care about social policies, like who marries who and who smokes what, et cetera. But, you are a fiscal conservative, so you sort into the Republican Party, even if it isn't a perfect fit, right? And so the two dimensions is helpful in thinking about just saying, like, one dimension ideology as a measurement is, there's a lot of error that occurs with that. The other issue is that the majority of Americans are what we call operationally liberal. In that sense, if you ask them, they say that they support raising the minimum wage, spending more money on education, government-sponsored healthcare. The Affordable Care Act, for how much it was a hot button issue for the 2012 election and so on, and used since then, people love it. People like the Affordable Care Act. It is something that's become wildly popular. And in some respects, I think Americans would support even more help in that area. So if you ask, and I was telling Krista that one of the easiest evidence of this is take a look at all the elections that happen, or all the elections that happen in various states in any election cycle, 2020 no exception. You will have a state that both passes changing a state flag that used to have a racist symbol and legalizing medical marijuana, but yet electing all Republicans, right? You might have another state that raises the minimum wage, or adds some kind of tax, sales tax increase or whatever to fund schools, but elects all Republicans, right? And so there is this disconnect between people being symbolically conservative or having a strong partisan attachment to the Republican Party, even though they actually support progressive policies. And so saying liberal conservative isn't typically very helpful in trying to understand exactly where these people's political views lie.
Thanks, Amanda. I think that that's really helpful. And I mean, even for me in my research around science communication, this is something that you and I have kind of talked about and even potentially collaborate on, is the idea that if we can sort of leave out the sort of identity label, we often can get more work done from a science standpoint, right? That if we're talking about scientific policy and specific, if we do our best to kind of remove some of the labeling that is around identity politics, then we often find that folks can get work done. So some of the work that I, cite really regularly in my work is some of the work that has been done in Broward County, Florida, right, which gets most of its money and its sort of support from tourism, right? So the reason why people go there is because they want beaches, right? They want the sort of beauty of the natural landscape, but supporting, let's say, policy around climate change might be something that might be seen as a more liberal approach. So if instead we argue that climate change is an economic development issue, then all of a sudden we've got more bipartisan support for a particular issue. So I think that plays out what you're talking about there. So I'd love to hear from some of the groups about your conversations about this, and that is sort of, are the labels, liberal and conservative, how are they potentially flawed, and what utility do those terms have? And so there's some conversation that I think is happening in the chat, and that might be Leah that's kind of sharing some ideas. If you've got some conversation, I'm happy to read kind of some of those ideas out in the chat, or if you would like to share with the group and just turn on your microphone and raise your hand, that would be great as well. So I'll pause here and see if we have folks that want to respond. And I always like to share at this moment that one of the easiest ideas is just to sort of report out on what your group said. You don't have to sort of share what your particular perspective is if it's more comfortable to do it that way, but it's always helpful to hear kind of what are the small group conversations looking like.
I'll share on behalf of my group. We kind of talked about the flaws of the terms liberal and conservative, and particularly where they might break down around, like, someone who calls themselves a classical liberal is probably a libertarian. They have kind of a free market economics, but so they might call themselves a liberal, but they may vote Republican, right? Or if you're a conservative, especially maybe not in the US so much, but like that might just mean that you don't think things should change very fast, right? That there should be kind of a slow, moderate pace of change around any sort of policy. I also am interested, like, Theodore Roosevelt was a conservative and he was a conservationist, and like the linkage of those terms, right? So we did talk about, though, the idea that Republican and Democrat have just become team labels. And so the one thing we like, or we wouldn't want to lose about something called liberal or conservative, is that it at least is kind of an adjective that might describe you, as opposed to like a team identity, and that something about team identity has gotten very toxic in our politics.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point, Leah, that one of the things that we do know that exists, particularly in the United States, and be interesting, Amanda, to hear about some of the international perspectives on this, is the sort of tribalism that exists within American politics that is about sort of, wearing the t-shirt, if you will, and how that plays out, like you said, from a sort of measurement standpoint. And how do you account for that in survey research and in other scientific research?
Yeah, so this is one of the, if you want to get a political scientist's blood pressure to go up, speaking of physiology, you will mix up ideology and partisanship. So one of the challenges, and we see this a lot because psychologists, for example, have gotten really excited about answering political questions. And one of the first projects I was on at Nebraska, we had a cognitive psychologist. We're using an eye tracking lab, really cool study, et cetera. And he collected the data, and we helped work in the lab. And as we were kind of we wanted to look at whether conservatives and liberals, left and right, people looked at different kinds of images when they're shown images on a screen. And he's like, "Oh yeah, I measured ideology. Here's the question." And I was like, "It says Republican, moderate, and Democrat." He's like, "Yeah, ideology." I'm like, "No, like, and if you're going to measure that, it should be independent, not moderate, right?" And so like partisanship is a completely other thing, right? And partisan attachment is a different thing. So we typically ask questions about folks' partisan attachment, so how they identify, and then we ask them, sort of the strength of that identification. And what's fascinating is that we have, typically when we ask this, it's like a branched question, and we'll ask if they, are independent leaning one way or another. And there are a lot of people who want to say, well, I'm independent leaning Republican or independent leaning Democrat. But most political science research have found that true independents are less than 10% of the American population. People say they're independent, but if you look at their voting record, they vote for the same party every time, right? But independent has become another team t-shirt to wear. It's a neutral, I'm my own person. I'm sure you've had conversations with people like this, like, I just look at both parties and I look at both candidates and I just really weigh it. And like, I don't belong to either one. I think they're both messed up. I just, as you may imagine, more men are independents, which is why I'm taking on that affect. And so there's this great book called Independent Politics by Samara Klar, who's at Arizona, and Yana Krupnikov, who's at Stony Brook. And it's I think one of the most helpful books about understanding why so many Americans want to be these pioneering mavericks who are like, oh, I'm not part of a party. Like, I'm cooler than that. I'm more logical than that. I didn't buy into that Kool-Aid, like whatever. And so independent as an identity is a whole other thing, even though they still vote the same as, so we actually tend to just I just finished coding some data this week where I put all the leaners into the bin they should go into, because I already know how they're voting, right? Like, they say that, like, if I could go back and look at all their voting questions and be like, oh, okay, well, you say you're an independent leaner, but you voted for Democrats on all these offices. So guess what? You're operationally, for me, a Democrat.
So that's a really good point. And I think that gets to my next question that I'll ask of you. And I'll just share, Amanda, since you're kind of new to this community, and for those that are new, one of the sort of hallmarks of Books, Booze, and Brains, because we have a scientist in the room, is we get a chance to get some of like the backstory on the science, like how the work is actually constructed. And so one of the things that I found interesting in this book was Hibbing and colleagues' conversation around the advantages and disadvantages to surveying people about their reactions to things versus actually measuring their physiological reactions to things. So can you talk about what the advantages and disadvantages are to that survey methodology versus the actual sort of, the method of measuring the sort of biological change in the person, and sort of why you might choose one versus the other?
So one of the early set of feedback that we got on this kind of work was this, a lot of pushback in political science, because people thought it was weird and out there. And there is an ideology, I'm sure you talk about this in your science, that scientists, we are not free from bias, obviously, right? And political scientists think, especially those who promote democracy or think democracy is good, that if we just educate people enough, they will come around. Like they're going to come around, and we just give them enough civic education, they're going to know the proper way to live together and so on, right? And so there was this pushback that there might be these deep-seated preferences that could have a genetic basis in some respects that might make them less malleable to persuasion. And that really bothered people, right? Then there was another set of skeptics who said, oh, great. So every time I run a survey, do I need to hook people up to a bunch of wires, or I won't know what's really going on, right? This really frustration and those of us who work in this area, we see it as one more way to measure what we think is going on, within people and how they think about politics. And then it just gives us a more well-rounded set of things. So there are some physiological measures that converge with self-report, that people react more strongly to certain. So for example, I'm working on a paper right now that's looking at people's physiological responses to images of candidates. And we find that people respond really strongly to images of Hillary Clinton. Later, an hour later, after being measured for their physiological response, we asked them to rate images of these candidates. People rate Hillary Clinton really negative, including Democratic men, which is part of the story for this paper. And so in that case, their physiology matched their self-report. But now we're figuring out this is pretty deep-seated. This isn't just like, not my favorite. This is like, I'm sitting here doing nothing with sensors on my fingers, measuring my electrodermal activity, and Hillary Clinton's face comes up and my blood starts to boil, right? That is a different kind of intensity than just, not my favorite, right? So I think that the advantage is helping us to really fully understand some of the intensity for some of these things. That being said, it's very expensive. The one study that I helped run was $1.5–2 million National Science Foundation study. We had 350 participants, which took weeks and weeks for them to come into the lab, be hooked up to everything, the training we had to do. I found out that my level of conscientiousness for following experimental protocols was a lot more strict than how other graduate students thought about things. So we had people putting sensors in the wrong place, which of course is going to mess things up, or chatting with the participants when we're supposed to just, so protocols can be really difficult to enforce, which is kind of the challenge as well. So I would say that, so that's kind of the trade-off, is that it can be expensive and it can be difficult to carry out. And, in the case of electrodermal response, we don't know valence, right? So I have another paper publication where we looked at people's responses to erotic images and compared it to their preferences for certain kinds of social and sexual policies. Suddenly I said the word erotic and I just lost my train of thought. Sorry. Just kidding. No, this is a real paper that I worked on. I was talking about.
You're talking about electrodermal responses and how it related specifically.
Oh, yes, sorry. Yeah. So the thing with for the erotic images, we found that people who responded more strongly tended to be to support abstinence-only sex education, and be against premarital sex, and then also against abortion. And so it's like, okay, well, when they're looking at these images, these erotic images, they were still just pictures of a heterosexual couple in a state of undress and embrace. I mean, very meant to be evocative. Are they responding because they really like it? Are they seeing it and they feel guilt and that's causing their response? We don't really have a measure of valence. We just know that it caused arousal, which is the technical term, but we were measuring just the skin, et cetera. So this can be one of the challenges, is we don't know exactly what's happening, right? And this is where neuroscience has a bit better of leverage on this, because they can actually look at, what part of the brain is being engaged when looking at certain kinds of images or having certain kinds of conversations and things like that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you for sharing that. There's a couple of questions that I think relate in the chat to some of the things that you're talking about. So I want to back up a little bit. And one of our participants, Leslie, sort of talked about the idea that when she identifies, I think Leslie is a woman, identifies as an independent because she just doesn't think that either party has all the right answers all the time. And she wanted to know, is there a biological basis for this that she is maybe potentially unaware of? Can you talk a little bit more about that sort of independent label or space?
Definitely, as I said, like 10% of Americans are true independents is kind of the best estimate we have. Of that 10%, a lot of those folks aren't interested in politics, and don't follow strongly enough to have strong opinions. And so a subset of people who are very political, are very well informed, are very interested, but find that um, their policies don't perfectly line up with the parties is kind of more about the fact that we have a two-party system that's pretty blunt, right? So I would say that, and this is I work in central tendencies and lots of error term and on average kinds of things across populations. So I'm not going to diagnose one person, but for a lot of people who select into a party that might not meet all of their preferences, they've decided that there's a certain area that's the most important to them, right? Or that there's something that like they're going to forgive the party the rest of the stuff that doesn't quite match up, right? And so perhaps for someone like Leslie, um, uh, there isn't a particular kind of policy issue or set of issues that rises above the others. And so that I could think a little bit about, there might be some cognition things like some people's need for closure, for example, like they just need to know I am in this party or that party. So Leslie might be more comfortable with ambiguity, for example, like is okay kind of flipping back and forth. So that could be part of that. But I would hesitate. I'm not a political psychiatrist, so.
Yeah. No, but I think that that's really interesting. I mean, like that one of the things that I'm always really interested in is how folks manage uncertainty, in part because I work with scientists to teach them how to talk about uncertainty and how people who are not scientists talk about uncertainty differently than scientists do. So I appreciate your thinking about that. I think that's helpful. So Leah asked an interesting question. I actually don't know the answer to this question, and that is when we think about some of the not survey-based measurement, but sort of physiological-based measurement that you do campaigns use this research as well? Do you know, and to what end?
In fact, it's actually the use, how do I want to say this? So I think it was the observation of campaign use of certain kinds of ads and rhetoric that led to a lot of the questions that we are now trying to answer with these kinds of measures, right? So guess what? Negative ads work. People hate them, but they work oftentimes for what folks are wanting to do, right? Because you have a type of response. There's also this interesting work that I think, and there is, like, if you look at advertising, advertisers have figured out what to do, right? Like, and so that's a really good parallel to politics and thinking about what's going to motivate people and so on. So in the emotions literature, what political scientists have found is that anger, for example, is mobilizing, but anxiety is not, right? So if you can, if you can get people angry about something, they're going to be more likely to turn out to vote, to march, to write a letter, et cetera. But if they're really anxious, this actually tends to sort of immobilize people or freeze them a bit, right? And so I think absolutely that campaigns, understand part of this. But one of the greatest challenges in American politics is that people keep wanting the parties to act the same, right? But our two parties are not symmetrical. And this is another great book I would point out if you're interested in this. It's called Asymmetric Politics by Grossman and Hopkins. And they carefully sort of document and demonstrate that the Republican Party is a party of philosophy, right? It's about conservative values, small government for certain kinds of fiscal things. Like, we don't care what you look like, who you love, where you come from. If you buy into this, welcome to the party, right? Democrats are a loose coalition of groups who want positive government. Positive government meaning we think government should be doing things for the people. And so you have, I mean, this loose coalition of groups are very, very different, right? So you have LGBTQ individuals, you have recent immigrants, you have conservative Christians who happen to be African American, you have all these different people who are Democrats because that's the party, and frankly, for the last 30 years, the only party that's willing to govern. And actually, like, if you look at legislation put through at the national level, Democrats are the party that's trying to govern, where Republicans have tried to stop governance and stop legislation going through, certainly since the Clinton years. And so, people keep wanting Democrats to act like Republicans, but that's not who their people are, their party are, or vice versa, right? And so also, like, Democrats are always wanting to compromise because they're used to that, because they're a loose coalition of groups that have to compromise. Republicans never have to compromise, right? Because in their party, there's this one message, and that's all that's needed, right? And so I think this frustrates people because they want them, one side wants the other to act like the other, but they're just not going to. And so, yeah.
No, I think that's really helpful, and I think actually gets us to our next Turn and Talk question. Melanie had a question about your survey construction strategy that I think we'll answer when we come back from this Turn and Talk question, because our Turn and Talk relates so closely to what you're talking about. And for this one, I'm actually going to put for the first time you get some stimulus material, I'm going to put a review, a quote from a book review into the chat because it's a little bit long, and I'll read it, but I'd love to hear kind of how your groups react to this is from Kirkus Review, and it sort of talks about the central premise of the book, and I think to some extent that this central premise could be debatable. So I'm going to throw it in the chat here, and so you'll see a chat from me, and I'll read it as well. So the review says, Hibbing and his co-authors suspect that what is ultimately being inherited is a set of core dispositions about how societies should resolve recurring problems, how to distribute resources. Should we be individualistic or collectivist? How to deal with outsiders and outgroups. Are they threatening or enticing? How to structure power relationships. Should we be hierarchical or egalitarian? And so on. These are, of course, problems that all human societies have had to grapple with. They are ancient. And inheriting a core disposition on how to resolve them would naturally predispose one to a variety of specific issue stances in a given political context. And so my question for your small groups is, do you agree or disagree that really what this book is about are these sort of ancient problems or ancient approaches to problem solving that we've had for a long time? And why or why not? So with that, I'll go ahead and again, if you want to take this quote with you into your breakout rooms, just make sure that you copy and paste it from the chat, and it should carry over with you. I'm going to go ahead and open the breakout rooms again, and I think I got everybody into a breakout room, but if you are not assigned, I'll get you assigned really quickly. And again, just accept that invitation when it opens. All right, your breakout room should open. Give me just a second, Amanda, and then we'll talk about this in the main room here. So for, let's see, Elliot and others, if you are having trouble joining, it looks like Elliot has been able to move, but if anybody would like to join a room and you're having trouble joining, please let me know. We're happy to move you over. So Amanda, I put that in the chat here. I know that you were obviously involved to some extent in this research, but I thought that this quote was interesting, in part because I think it is potentially reductionist. But I would be interested to kind of hear about your thoughts about kind of, is part of what you think that Hibbing and his colleagues are trying to measure here, are a set of sort of predispositions or approaches to problem solving that have just always existed, and to what end? Why does that matter?
The basic definition of politics that I start with on day one of my intro class is the definition by Harold Lasswell: who gets what, right? So that's what politics is how do we manage and organize group life? And so, yeah, I mean, I think, Aristotle, is man a political animal, right? So for a very long time, trying to understand like how do we live together? How do we live in increasingly larger scale societies? Are certainly really old questions, right? And so that part, yeah, absolutely, I think that's right. And I think the things that they bring up, so distribution of resources, how we think about in-group, out-group, how we think about power, and then I would add to that just, and someone brought this up earlier, like how we think about change, right? Like how comfortable we are with change. I think those are kind of the major tenets that underlie a lot of people's political beliefs and orientations, right? And so, again, you could take somebody with a certain disposition or, like the kinds of personality traits that are pretty consistent throughout their lifetime, and put them into a different political context. And it might express itself in a different type of way. And it's hard to do this research. There's been a little bit of research that happens looking at people when they've immigrated. So when they have gone to another country, for example, but that's pretty difficult because there's a lot of other things at play, just in addition to, oh, okay, well, now I'm in a different context, and so on. What do you think is reductionist about that?
I think that I think it's the change piece, actually. That for me, that's the biggest piece that's missing from this summary. And I think that, and maybe it's because of the research that I do, this question about kind of, at the core of my work is I think a rhetorical question, not rhetorical in the sense of, I'm not meaning to ask you not how we use rhetorical now, but instead a persuasion question, right? Which is fundamentally, are you changeable? Can your mind be changed? And I think that is a lot of the work that I do is really focused on kind of what is the role of new senses of understanding, new learning in our ability to change our perception of particular issues. Because we do know, to some extent, we see societies change. I mean, if you take LGBTQ issues, for example, I mean, it's a place where we've seen the United States move really relatively dramatically in a short period of time. And so I think that for me, the reason why this, I think, is a little bit reductionist is that it gets at some of the power issues, but I think for me, it also is this issue about change and one's interest in and ability to be changed. So you added that, which I think for me is where the primary issue is.
Well, and it is, kind of back to one of my opening comments, it's about priors too, right? So if you have a fairly crystallized view, your change is going to be a bit more resistant, right? And so, I think it's been interesting over the past 6 months looking at, for example, a lot of white Americans who would have not really thought a lot about racial justice, who now, are flying Black Lives Matter flags and are, sort of like have reminders to contact public officials and are going to city council meetings and all this kind of stuff. And that works because they didn't have a strong, you didn't have people who were like pro-police or something suddenly flip, right? Like, so you have these people who were kind of just like not mobilized on this issue, but open to it. But you think about something, I've been fascinated over the last 4 years about this flip for certain conservatives when he is with, or even the flip now against Fox News, right? So this push against Fox News because it has been critical of Trump, that, you have this change, but it comes from this like loyalty to this other thing. And I don't know that we have really good answers about when and how that's happening.
Well, and it's especially interesting because the change is against something, right? That it's not a change towards something, it's a change away from something. And I think that it's, in that case, it's for me, it's not about openness, it's about closeness.
Yeah.
And I think that is also an interesting piece of this. So when you look at these kinds of issues in your research, kind of thinking about like people's ability to change or kind of better understanding, particularly around something like gender or racial justice issues, how has your work been able to kind of address some of these issues and ask questions about these issues over time?
So I've never had enough money to do an overtime longitudinal study, right? Like that's the gold standard, is to be able to track these kinds of things. So I'm pretty reliant on meta-analyses from other scientists, or when it comes to measurement, like using psychometrically sound question batteries and so on to feel a bit more confident. I don't tend to make up research questions. I actually just this year, or I guess just this month, published a discussed paper where we did invent a new measure. But that's a really tricky thing to do because you don't quite know what it is that you're capturing and if it's going to replicate and so on over time. So I think that in the absence of being able to follow somebody like through a life course, which there are some studies like that. There's one in New Zealand that is kind of the gold standard. They've been following folks for a long time. And there's actually a lot of twin studies. So the Minnesota twin study and the Virginia Commonwealth twin study have also done this, is to, continue to get more precise with our measurements. So my colleague and I, Alex Jonskevich, have been using continuous measures of gender identity in our last two projects because, just asking someone if they identify as a man or a woman, like it gets you a fair amount of differences in different kinds of things. But if you want to know something like an emotion being evoked, knowing whether a person feels masculine or feminine, or rates themselves as extremely masculine or extremely feminine and so on is helpful. But we have yet to do a lab study because we also know that part of identifying as masculine and feminine is social identity theory kinds of things, or social role theory, where there's a presentation aspect. So my very first publication was measuring physiological disgust, and we find that when we ask people if they're disgusted by things versus showing them disgusted things, that conservative men tend to overreport being, or underreport. They say they are not disgusted, but when you show them things like maggots in a wound or eating worms, they're like just as disgusted, right, as conservative women. And then conversely, women say they're more disgusted than their physiological response demonstrates, right? So again, getting back to how physiology can help us better understand what's happening, kind of at the base level.
Yeah, I think that that's really helpful. And just to kind of give you a preview, one of the things that I would like to ask you and like to ask you to talk about as we talk about this with the group is to talk about kind of to what end. So like when we think about the disgust research, for example, understanding more deeply kind of what are the ideas that hang together there? What do we really want to discover? And what do we think that will help us to do? I think will be one of the interesting things for this group to answer. So I just gave them a 1-minute warning. I'm going to close their rooms and then I'll go ahead and bring them back to the main room here. Welcome back, everybody. We had a great conversation here. I'm excited to give you a chance to listen to it. We will get started when we get everybody back from the main, back in the main room here in about 30 seconds or so. They should be coming back here in just a few minutes. Welcome back, everyone. I always joke that I know it's a good books, booze, and brains conversation when I close those breakout rooms and you guys take the whole minute to come on back to the main room. That's always a good sign, I think. So I hope that you were all having good conversations, and I apologize to have to stop those. We had a good conversation here in the main room, Dr. Friesen and I did. And just as a recap, I gave you kind of this longish quote from a book review that essentially argues that there are some sort of very ancient or deeply held, if you will, conflicts around individualism versus collectivism, around in-group and out-group, around hierarchy versus egalitarian, that that this particular book review argued Hibbing and colleagues is really trying to measure here. And so my question for all of you and for Dr. Friesen is, do you agree or disagree with this sentiment? Are politics primarily about our approach to solving problems, or is there something else happening? And so, Amanda, I wonder if maybe you could start to talk a little bit about the kind of one addition that you had to this sort of list of items that was really my sticking point.
Yeah, I think when I think about how ideology is defined, or how we think about people's sort of general approach to politics, usually it is about comfortability with the two things that typically I say is how comfortable you are with inequality, and how you feel about change, right? And so, you know, this quote kind of gets at that with redistribution and power and so on, but definitely those are kind of, if you want to summarize like sort of like the general things that underpin individual level responses, is this sort of, yeah, like, do you think, you know, people are just unequal, like that's just how it's going to be, and so like what are we going to do? You know, this isn't a problem. And you can see how that tracks with people's preferences for policies, like how far do they want to go with redistribution, and so on, and then how comfortable they are with change, which I think Leah or someone brought up earlier about this sort of I think this slow to change, or this caution with certain kinds of changes, is useful. And you know, sometimes political scientists will say something like, you know, that in a two-party system, you have the party that's the accelerator and the party that's the brake. And so you kind of want, it's helpful if the parties take turns with this, right? So depending on who's in power, so you want your opposition party to sort of like putting the brake on things that, you know, are maybe going too fast. And so, you know, that's another kind of way to think about comfortability with change.
Unmuted. There we go. I think that metaphor is helpful, that you know, kind of accelerator versus brake metaphor, in part because for me that was really one of the I guess the questions that I had about this review, is this sense of comfortability with change, especially given what I study, right? The idea that potentially having more and more accurate information doesn't change people's minds about an issue. So knowing that that's the case, what tools do we have, right? So the work that I do is primarily focused on thinking about those sort of storytelling strategies and other rhetorical strategies that we use to potentially encourage change, because we do know that over time certain perceptions do change, right? So if you look in this country, Amanda, you mentioned issues of racial equality. I talked about LGBTQ issues, which have changed in a really very short period of time, given the history of these issues in the United States. So I think that is an important part of this. So Leah put something in the chat, and I want to give everybody kind of an opportunity, if your group had an interesting or robust conversation, to share a little bit about this question. Is this book really about these kind of really long-standing or ancient issues or approaches to problem solving, and what your thoughts were on that? And if you would like to sort of share your group's perspective, again, you don't need to share your own perspective, but instead just report from your group, that would be great. We'd love to hear your voice here and hear what your group talked about.
I have a response to Leah's point.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so Leah talks about how, you know, essentially a very, you know, primary colors view or whatever, right? So that people go into politics because of power and not necessarily to solve problems. And I think that we have seen this at work at a lot of levels of government in the US and all over the world. And one really interesting thing, so I have been teaching gender and politics for 10 years, and I don't study campaigns and elections. That's not, I mean, I'm studying how people sweat, right? Like I'm at a very, very micro foundation level. But one really interesting thing is that, you know, when women are asked, so the kind of women who run for office, which I could spend a 3-hour call on this, is they usually run for office to do something, right? So they notice something happen in their neighborhood. I love the example, if any of you have watched Modern Family. So Claire decides to run for city council because there aren't enough stop signs in their neighborhood or whatever, right? So they see something wrong, and so they run for school board, they run for city council. You saw this in so in 2020, more women ran for office than ever before, and we now have more women in Congress than we've ever had before, including more Republican women running, right? And so women tend to run for office to do something. All of the research and interviews have revealed this. Certainly men run for office, oftentimes to do something, but more often than not, it can be just a career choice or an interest in power and leadership and things like this. Work that is done, comparative work around the world, looking at the number of women in parliaments and so on, have found that when there are more women in office, particularly after a quota has been enacted, a gender quota, that women tend to spend less money on defense, more money on healthcare, education, and these kinds of things, right? And so I think there's this fascinating, if you think about this from a psychological perspective, whether it's because women as mothers, as caregivers, as nurturers, and so on, will only dip their toe into the water of the very masculine world of politics because they want to protect the things that are really, really important to them, right? And so, yeah, this quote oftentimes, and you could say a criticism of the whole book, is that it has this sort of assumption of what I would call white dude bro politics, right? These are the guys who want to sit around the salons and talk about why Alexander Hamilton shot somebody in a duel over a central bank or something, right? Not about the kinds of things that affect people's everyday lives. And so I think that, yeah, thinking about things like gender identity or even just basic sex of men and women can help us, in addition to race and other kinds of identities, better understand, how people think about solving these problems.
Thanks, Amanda. That's a really good, I think, example, and helps us to kind of more deeply understand some of the, I always love when we have a scientist can offer their assessment of the book, but also offer potentially a critique of the book, right? What are some of the things that are maybe missing from this conversation? And one of the things that you mentioned there, and that you talked about a little bit earlier, is about sort of the gender differences that exist both in this research and in your research. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit, you mentioned earlier some of the work that you've done around gender and disgust specifically. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about that and how that work is, I think, potentially sort of furthering our understanding of these issues, and kind of to what end?
Yeah, so another way that I would say that using physiology to better understand some of these emotions and attitudes is that people respond to surveys in socially desirable ways, right? So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with implicit association tests to try to uncover racism, which I could have a whole hour on criticizing and talking about what those do and don't do. But trying to get at why are people answering things the way they do. So my first publication, actually, we were looking at the connection between attitudes toward same-sex couples getting married and disgust. So this is a finding that was established in the mid-2000s, that people who reported higher disgust to certain kinds of situations and so on tended to oppose same-sex marriage. And so social psychologists are trying to explain that there's this ick factor with people thinking about same-sex couples. And so the reason why that matters is that, if people say, well, it's against my religious beliefs, then why would there be a disgust factor, right? So there's something happening with that helps us better understand why people might oppose a certain policy. So if you want to try to advocate, you have, as Krista was talking about, trying to, or Dr. Longton was talking about, trying to reframe in a way that could kind of get around that. So anyway, in our study, so we used data from 2007 and 2008 from a group of adults in Nebraska. And we found that, for example, when we gave people survey questions that said, how disgusted would you be if you picked up a dead cat? Or you ate a bowl of soup that had been stirred with a used fly swatter that had been cleaned? That is a literal survey question that is in this battery, which is really bizarre. How disgusted would you
I was
feel?
looking at Rita's face. Rita, your face was just priceless in that. That was amazing.
Yeah. How would you feel about eating a piece of candy that looked like dog poop, right? So all these kinds of things, and people respond to it. So this battery, this 3 domains of disgust battery, and there's sexual disgust, moral disgust, all parts of these. Women tend to report being more disgusted than men. And so the explanation is in the evolutionary environment of adaptiveness, women had to be careful about pathogens and so on, and they had to make sure because they were possibly carrying a baby or, were worried about their own health and taking care of their offspring, whereas men, are risk takers and so on and didn't have to worry about this as much, right? This is kind of the evolutionary understanding. Well, in our study, we showed people disgusting images. So someone eating worms, a wound with maggots in it, right? Vomit in a toilet. And what's fascinating is even though on the battery of questions about the dead cat and the fly swatter, women were like, oh yeah, totally grossed out. And men were like, no, it's fine. On the actual EDAs, the actual skin conductance response to seeing things, no difference in men and women, right? Men and women responded similarly. There was the same averages, right? And so you have this certain men underreporting that things disgust them, right? And then you have this overreporting, women saying that they're disgusted because it's sort of this social role they feel like they're supposed to have, like they're supposed to say that they're disgusted by this. Well, what's interesting is, as a follow-up, a colleague of mine, it just came out this month in Politics and Life Sciences, and I think it's free access till the end of the year. I'm sure you're all just typing this out. But we started to think about this fly swatter and this dead cat, and we're like, when are people doing this? Like, what are the, what are these situations? And Alex, my colleague, he's like, women do a lot of gross stuff. Like, they change more diapers than men do. They probably have had to give an elderly parent a bath. Like, they do all these caregiving tasks, like clean up vomit and whatever. That's pretty gross. So what if we ask those questions? So we went through and we took all of those, there were a few questions like, how disgusted would you be if you heard a stranger clear their throat of mucus? And we just wrote, if you heard your partner clear their throat of mucus, right? And so we just reframed it in this, or if someone sneezed in your soup, right? If it was a stranger versus if it's your a loved one or a family member. And we did this survey was last January, so before COVID, in case anyone's wondering. I could talk about disruption on other things from COVID. But anyway, again, we found that everyone, men and women, and we also asked continuous measures of gender identity. So how masculine you feel, how feminine you feel, and that everyone rated these caregiving tasks as less disgusting than these weird groups of things that we've been using for 10 years to try to say how disgusted people are. And we further found that whether people and women were slightly less disgusted on the caregiving items than men were, but we found that that the connection to attitudes, and so of course we updated the same-sex marriage attitudes because that is there are still people who obviously oppose same-sex couples marrying, but that issue is just not as salient. So we used transgender folks to be able to use the bathroom of their choice and some other kinds of sexual things. And we found no relationship between these caregiving disgust items and these attitudes that people have said is about being disgusted, right? And so anyway, just trying to think and be creative about what are these emotions that might be underlying certain people's attitudes. And also to challenge that quote about these sort of immutable dispositions. Disgust no longer predicts same-sex marriage because it has now been taken up as something in society that's a fairness issue, right? And so you can see that our context does matter with the way that our emotions are activated to try to predict these kinds of attitudes.
Well, and I also think that we've seen lots of different really interesting examples, particularly that I would argue that for-profit companies have used in an effort to reduce the ick factor around this issue, right? So if you look at some of the, Hallmark had a very interesting campaign a few years ago that focused on couples, both heterosexual couples and LGBT couples, talking about what they love about their partner, right? And so these kinds of, I think, campaigns, which do an interesting thing because they, of course, try to tap into a market that was otherwise untapped, it also, I think, you know, kind of combats some of those initial perspectives that maybe folks may have had around these particular issues. So I'm looking at the clock and I can't believe the time has gone so fast. We have about 8 minutes left, and usually we end our conversations with just an opportunity for folks who are here in the room with us to ask some questions directly of our scientific experts. So Dr. Friesen, if you'd be okay, I'll open up the floor for questions. And we've got some questions that have come through in the chat over time, but I want to make sure that we have an opportunity for folks. If you do have a question specifically of Dr. Friesen, that you could ask that question. Again, you're welcome to use the chat, or this is a great time to go ahead and turn on your mic and camera and you can ask that question directly. So I'll pause for a minute and see what questions you have.
Hi, I'll jump in if nobody else has a question. I just posted it on the chat. I
Thanks,
just
Leslie.
realized I forgot to put it to everybody. The country's so divided now. You know, we're in a very difficult time in our history. So given what you know about the physiological differences affecting our emotions and attitudes, what do you think is the best approach to bring the country together?
So this is another major criticism of this book, right? Is I think at the end, you know, this sort of like, how can we all get along? Are we destined to be enemies? You've seen this in some memes, like in social media and so on, you know, that your neighbor's going to go back to being your neighbor the day after the election, right? And one of the issues with this is that if you are arguing about something like, should the Federal Reserve raise interest rates, right? Let's say you're having a heated, good old fun discussion about this, right? You can probably walk away from that and still be friends. But today, when you have people who are saying, people who belong to a party who are saying that somebody who shot 2 protesters should run for Congress, I don't know how to have a conversation with that person and come together, right? And I'm a white person who is, you know, has a PhD and has all sorts of like privilege and so on. And like my rights generally are not terribly affected. But I think it's really problematic to say that we should come together when there's a group of people who clearly want rights taken away from another group of people. Like that's not a democracy. And so, I mean, I think this is a challenge, and the United States is not alone. So far right populist parties, xenophobic parties have been on the rise in Europe for, you know, a couple, 2-3 decades already, right? And definitely in other parts of the world, they're grappling with these issues. And so, you know, I don't know that the answer is coming together. I mean, I think that, yeah, I don't know that there is an answer with that, because you're going to have to either ignore, you know, basic rights being taken away from people, you know, in order to have a conversation with some other folks. I think one of the things that my field is trying to grapple with is how people were able to radicalize so quickly. Because of course, I mean, we have not had equality in this country ever. I mean, this country was built on stolen land with a constitution that enshrined slavery. Like from the beginning, it was a few people got to rule and the rest just lived here and were oppressed, right? So like this idea that American democracy, like just this isn't who we are. No, this is how it was designed. Like this is the country that this is it. This is how it was designed, right? I think that the people who've been fighting for rights and democracy for the century since then, you know, are who we should look to admire and so on. But I think, yeah, so this is how it's always been, but like this sort of like public radicalization and, you know, I think for us as political scientists, this like unwillingness to cede power, like this has just been like mind blowing, right? Like, so it's one thing to have certain policies that maybe are oppressive and not helpful and so on, but then like, just like the basic, like walk away when you lost the election. There's a book by a famous comparative political scientist called Losers Consent, that the whole idea is that democracy hinges on the losers consenting. You have to walk away. I think that I don't know how you bring together people when one group refuses like the most basic part of what it means to be a democracy is whether or not, you know, the results of the election should be respected. Um, it's not good. This is not good. I have no hope to share with you on this. Um, I think that authoritarianism is probably pretty easy to stir in people. And that's kind of an aspect, I guess, of the psychological factor of getting at that, but it's not great.
Well, I think that one of the things that, and thank you for answering that question, because I know it's a tough question to answer, right? That question that is about sort of what do those next steps look like? Because I think if any of us knew the answer to that, we would be like, oh yeah, legit, okay, let's do that. And you know, at least when we talk about things like science and public health communication, for example, I don't necessarily have all the right answers about that. I do know kind of what has traditionally worked and what hasn't traditionally worked, and some of those strategies still do work, and some of them are in this current political situation not working at all. And so I think that thinking about those things is important, even if we don't necessarily have an outcome that sounds particularly hopeful or one that that has a particular strategy that we can hang our hats on.
I
But
will say
go ahead,
one
Amanda.
thing though is that if you want to think about our evolutionary selves and so on, and this is, I'm always making a plug to get involved in state and local politics. State and local politics, like stop only paying attention to the national politics, right? If you get involved in your city councils, your county commissions, your state legislatures, I do think it's more difficult for people to be uh, vitriolic and oppressive to their neighbors, right? Like, so I think there is a difficulty. Whereas when it's like just these people in Washington or that's an anonymous message board or whatever. So, like, I think that it's going to be in communities, you know, where we start. If there's any hope, it's in community grassroots kinds of building around trying to address these issues, neighbors talking to each other and trying to think about what's the best thing for our city. And so, and I think there is that interpersonal connection. I think there's I could talk about hormones and pheromones and detection of power signals and so on when you're talking with other people. But that would be like, if I wanted to offer a hope thing, it would be that we should be working at that level.
Yeah, and I think that holds water in some of my research as well, right? That if we look at kind of, you know, the example that I gave earlier around seeing climate change policy as associated with economic development, right? At the end of the day, we all live in a community that we want to be prosperous. We want to have jobs. We want to have schools that are funded. And if that means tourism and having beautiful beaches, and that means protecting some wildlife, then we're going to have to get on board with that. So I think that plays out. There's a couple of questions in the chat that I want to get to. I know that we've got just a couple of minutes left. So Amanda, if you can answer these questions really quickly. Bruce had a question that is about this notion of voting against your best interest and to what extent I think that plays into these larger issues. And then there's a question from Rachel that asks, has there been a study with immigrants who have participated in political or social studies early on after they came to the US and then several years later? Do views change in substantial ways? And I will share one of the conversations, if you want to go back and listen to it, that Amanda and I had offline, is just how expensive longitudinal studies are. And I 100% agree with her that, like, that's one of those reasons that we do want to keep voting for science funding. It's really expensive to follow people around. We would love to do it, but it's really hard. So with that, Amanda, I'll let you take both those questions in the chat before we wrap up.
Sure, yeah. The best interest question. So I think this most famously became part of the public discourse with What's the Matter with Kansas, right? So this is this book that a lot of people paid attention to and read. And, you know, I think what the challenge is when you mean interest, what does that mean? So economic interests, you know, I think is the most common thing. So like, you know, so for example, traditionally in this country, the Republican Party is the party of the rich and the Democratic Party is the party of the poor, right? Labor unions, working class. And you've seen this like flip with this because people are culturally conservative. And so even though, you know, perhaps some Republican policies aren't in their best interests, they would say their other interests are just as important, right? And so I think it's really challenging to understand or to think about that. But you also have the role of conspiracy thinking and challenges with this, right? And so white supremacy is in the interests of a lot of white people, right? And so if you are with the party that continues to uphold white supremacy, that's helpful to you, even if they aren't necessarily putting policies into place that gets you a job, right? And so I think that we all have underestimated the role of white supremacy in this country and how that has influenced people's attitudes and their partisanship. So, but yeah, that's a tough question because people would define their interests in different ways. For the studies question, there's actually some interesting work on first, second, and third generation immigrants. So looking at differences in, for example, so for Latino immigrants, the first generation who came to the US tend to be more religious, tend to be a bit more conservative and so on. And when you get to the second and the third generation, they tend to be a bit more secular, a little bit less religious, and this can kind of influence their partisan affiliation, maybe, and part of their vote choice. So there are some interesting things having to do with that. I can think of just 2 studies where they were able to measure people's belief sets sort of like right when they came to the US and then later. But again, this is a really tough thing because recent immigrants also are a tough population to study. And ethically, sometimes it can feel like a challenging thing to study because of asking about documentation status and things like this. So I do think this is definitely in some ways, we don't know a lot more about this, like how this changes over time. Yeah.
That's a great point that there are lots of, whenever we think about survey research like this, there are lots of those sort of social issues that are embedded in it. And I think that shapes our view of the science, right? That's ultimately what the challenge is. So we are out of time. I can't believe how quickly our time went. Please join me in thanking Dr. Amanda Friesen from IUPUI for being here with us tonight. Always really fun to sort of venture out into a new area. So the political science, I think, bent on this conversation is something we haven't had before. I hope you all really enjoyed it. I'm going to go ahead and put the next set of books in the chat. I copied and pasted those from when Leah put them in previously. Just as a reminder that we take the month of December off. So we will look forward to seeing you back in the new year. Please do check your email. And if you have not joined our email list yet, you can join it using the Indiana Humanities website. So if you just go to Indiana Humanities and go to Google Books, Booze, and Brains, you'll find a place to join our email list. We would love to share with you the dates for each of these upcoming books. Amanda, thank you again so much. This was such a blast to have you here tonight. I hope that everyone enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for your engagement as always, and we will see you back after the new year. Be safe, stay home, wear your mask. Good to see you all.